everybody.
Hi.
Thank you for the response, Brett. If you weren't on our flower walk earlier today, welcome to the lecture. I'm Kathy Maloney. I'm with the Frederick Law Olmsted Society, and this is one of the lectures and events that we have regularly, and especially for this year, which, as you know, is our sesquicentennial, the village of Riverside's sesquicentennial. 150 years ago, Olmsted and Vaux created the design for Riverside. So we're trying to do some special things this year. Coming up, just so you can put it on your calendar, September 28th is our house walk. We haven't had one for about 5 years. We've got some great houses on the house walk. There's Hop Stop, which is a craft beer festival, also the same day, and there's a lecture the night before on Friday night, which is free, with Blair Kamen and his wife, Barbara Mahaney. Blair is the architecture critic for the Chicago Tribune, and his wife, Barbara, is a published author and writer as well. So we hope you can join us for that, as well as a number of other events that are coming up. But today, we're very pleased and excited that we could have Chris Benda, who goes by the moniker the Illinois Botanist. And Chris has taught at a number of institutions around Chicago. He's an expert on native plants in Illinois, and I'm sure many other places as well. And the best part is he talks so that I can understand him, even when he's talking Latin every now and then. So he's a lot of fun to listen to, and please join me in welcoming Chris.
Thank you very much. As I was telling the class that I was teaching this weekend, I was working in Missouri last week, and I had a landowner threaten to kill and bury me on his land if I was trespassing, which I had no intention of doing. So I've been telling all the groups, I'm very excited to be here. And this is one of my favorite topics, the wildflowers of the home garden, Illinois native wildflowers. So first of all, this beautiful scene is at LaRue Pine Hills Ecological Area, which is down in the Shawnee National Forest of Southern Illinois. So my name is Chris Benda, and I am a self-employed botanist, and I work with a large number of different institutions, particularly the Martin Arboretum up here, and teach a lot of classes there. In fact, I'm leading a Northern Flatwoods tour tomorrow before I head back home about 5 hours south where I live in Southern Illinois. So I go by Illinois Botanizer, and I have the website, illinoisbotanizer.com, and also all the social media taken care of. I mainly post on my Facebook page. I travel all around the state all summer long and during the growing season, giving tours and presentations and making my own observations and visits. So it's kind of fun to follow me along on Facebook and see where I'm going and learn about plants and other neat wildlife in Illinois. And I let everybody know this is what I do for a living, so I'm available for hire in various ways if you need a botanist or hear from someone else that does. And I've also been creating some merchandise, which I have up here for sale, some magnets, some puzzles, some very pretty coasters. So if you're interested in a gift or a souvenir, come talk to me after the presentation and take a look at the merchandise. Also on my website, I moved to Illinois in 2004, and I've been botanizing like crazy, taking photos and all sorts of things. So I'm putting these photos available on my website now at illinoisbotanizer.com. And they're just alphabetical by Latin name for now, but the idea is eventually I'll create a searchable database. So you can go in there and say, I saw a plant, it was in the forest, it had a red flower, it had alternate leaves, it had milky sap or whatever, and then it'll narrow down the options and give you identification clues. I also like to mention that last December I was able to hike on the River to River Trail, which goes from the Ohio River at Elizabethtown to the Mississippi River at Grand Tower. It's about 160 miles long, and I took 10 days to do the hike, and I wrote on my blog every day about the hike, talking about the natural history, the plants I encountered, and various observations. So on my homepage, there are links to all 10 days on my blog where I write about that hike, so you may be interested in learning about that. Also, at the Morton Arboretum, I developed this class last year, Botanical Names Demystified. So it goes through why do we use scientific names, what do they mean, how do they relate to plants, and a lot of interesting information and humor mixed in. So it's really a fun course. It's online, totally online class. I think they'll offer it again in the spring. So you can take it from home and learn a little bit about botanical names. Also, I'd like to let everybody know when I speak to groups about the Illinois Native Plant Society. We are a statewide organization with 7 chapters throughout the state. The Northeast chapter is loosely based in the Chicago region, and they're very active. They have a lot of field trips and events. And so if you're interested in learning about native plants or figuring out where to go look at them or identify them, it would be an excellent group to be a part of. I actually have some membership forms up here, and I also have a publication that I produced called A Guide to Summer Wildflower Hikes in Southern Illinois, which I realize is a long way from here, but might inspire you to go visit. And these are free. We had funding to produce these recently, so you can help yourself there. I have maybe a dozen up here if you're interested in a little wildflower guide. So a lot of good reasons to get involved with the Illinois Native Plant Society. Also, if you do the Facebook thing, and I'm a regular user, I created this group called Illinois Botany, and it's a place where you can make observations or ask ID questions or various information about native wild plants, or they don't have to be necessarily native, but wild occurring plants in Illinois. So Illinois Botany, if you want to learn more about plants using Facebook. And then this last little thing that's interesting that we're doing with the Plant Society is the Big Year competition. And we've been doing this for a few years now, where people will make observations of plants and post them to iNaturalist, and they get entered into the contest, and it's to see who can find the most plants in Illinois in a given calendar year. So the 2 gentlemen right now who are neck and neck in the lead, they have about just under 800 species that they've identified so far this year. And the winner usually comes in about 1,000 or 1,100 species identified. So there's about 3,600 species known for the state. But the interesting thing about this is that we're building a data set. This is citizen science. We're collecting valuable information, sharing it on iNaturalist, and eventually we'll be able to make all sorts of analysis from that data. So I like to mix in a little bit of humor in my presentation. So I started with this meme here, plant related. The Germinator, Hosta on Visa, baby. We also have poplar trees and not very popular trees. All right, so moving on, I want to start with this story because it really relates to a lot of the concepts that I'm going to mention throughout the presentation. But this gentleman here is Dr. Jerry Wilhelm, and he wrote this amazing work of art called The Flora of Chicago Region. It just came out in 2017, co-authored with Laura Rarica. And he has an interesting story in the back of this book where he talks about how he got involved into botany. And I'd like to briefly share that story with you. And again, it will relate to some of the concepts I talk about later. So Jerry, in his own words, said he was never the best student, and in high school he was so-so and wasn't sure he was going to go on to college. But honestly, when he graduated, it was during the Vietnam War, and he was concerned that he would be drafted, and so he went to community college just to stay in school and avoid that. And he did fine and well enough to continue on to university in Florida, and he studied marine biology, and in his own words, he said he was just an average student. But when he finished with his studies, the war was still going on, and he was drafted, and he was sent to, he went to go to report for duty with the U.S. Army, and a superior called him in his office and said, fill out this form. We're going to figure out how to place someone with your skills and abilities. And so he filled it out, and it had a form as the line that said, list scientific equipment used. And so he wrote a few things on there, used a scanning electron microscope, I've used a centrifuge, scientific equipment. So this guy called him in a couple weeks, and he said, Wilhelm, have you ever used a test tube? And he was like, what? It says here you have a biology degree. Have you ever used a test tube? And he's like, of course. And he said, put it on the form. You didn't write it on the form. Okay, puts it down. Have you ever used a petri dish? Yes. Put it on the form, he said. Okay, so he wrote, I've used a 250 milliliter beaker, I've used a graduated cylinder, I've used a Bunsen burner, and all these scientific equipment. So this same guy calls him in a few weeks later, and he says, Wilhelm, who do you know? And he says, I don't know anybody. I know Jimmy, the guy in the bunk next to me. He's like, Jimmy's no one. Who do you know? I don't know what you mean. He said, well, you've gotten your orders when you were going to Vicksburg, Mississippi to work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And he was convinced that they had made a giant mistake, but he was happy he was not going to be going overseas. So he said, okay, going to Vicksburg, Mississippi, see what the Army Corps of Engineers has in store for me. And he gets there, and they think he's some kind of hotshot scientist. They got themselves a bigwig, on their team. And he was convinced the Army had made a mistake, but he was going to follow through and do what they needed. So this was in, I think, 1970 or so, and a few years earlier they passed the National Environmental Policy Act, which required environmental assessment of all federal projects and how it will impact the environment. So they said your first duty, job number one, go up to Lockport, Illinois. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is dredging the river at Lockport, and we need to know where can we put the dredge spoils. We're going to scoop this soil and dirt out of the river. We need to dump it on land. Where can we do that won't impact adversely in the environment? And he thought, oh my gosh, what am I getting into? So he came up here and he hooked up with Floyd Swink and Ray Schulenberg, eminent biologists at the Morton Arboretum, working in relative obscurity at the time. He took them out to these field sites, and first many sites, Ray would say, there's Daucus carota, there's Taraxacum officinale, there's Dactylus glomerata, European weeds. And he would say, Jerry, you can spoil here, it will grow back. Well, they continued on and they went to what is now Lockport Prairie Nature Preserve. At that time, it was just land along the river that hadn't been developed, and there was one of the dredge spoil sites. And they went there, and Ray went, oh, Echinacea pallida, and Andropogon scoparius, and Bouteloua critipendula. And he looked up at Ray, and he said, looked up at Jerry, and he said, Jerry, do not spoil here, for this is America, and it will not grow back. And what he meant was, these are North American assemblage of plants that have co-evolved together over hundreds of thousands of years, that have interactions with the soil and the microbes and the climate and the animals and all these things. They belong together in this intact, pristine, hardly been altered natural community, versus everywhere else in the landscape was degraded. It was pasture, it was farm, it was roadside or old field or lawn, and those are all European weeds, frankly, that are dominating these places. So this was the epiphany that Jerry had. He said this was his moment in life where it changed his life. And he said, I wanted to know from that point forward when I was standing in America and when I wasn't. So he went on to become one of the premier biologists in North America of the world with this amazing work of art that he has produced recently. So he came up with this concept called the coefficient of conservatism. And the coefficient of conservatism relates to the idea that there are these plants that we don't see on the landscape. Only when we go to natural areas do we find them. These intact, untouched, set-aside natural remnants in the landscape. And so he developed this idea that said, well, okay, let's rank these plants on a scale of 0 to 10. Give them a number. The native species most successful in badly damaged habitats get a value close to 0. Those are what I call ecologically weeds. They're weedy species. They're found sidewalk cracks and roadsides and pastures and lawns, etc. Versus the plants that are restricted to where they grow, virtually restricted to natural areas, or these intact natural community remnants, then they get a value close to 10. We would say that's a conservative plant. So a lot of the plants some of the plants in this slideshow are quite conservative. If you look at like some of our lilies, you don't find wood lily growing anywhere. You see it in a high quality intact plant community. So it is a C value close to 10. I think that one might actually be a 10 or possibly 9. So really useful. So not only did he come up with this concept, he developed it, and now Illinois has numbers for all the other states have numbers that relate to this concept of what's the conservatism value. So a natural community, in other words, is an area of land or water, has retained or recovered its original natural character, but it need not be completely undisturbed. Sort of our definition of a high-quality natural community. So we think of it as a pristine area or nearly pristine, very high quality and high quality, grade A and grade B sites. Now George Fell had a lot of this similar thinking, but he came along a little earlier. He was around in the 40s and 50s, and a lot of his ideas really started to take traction in the 1960s. And he noticed also that he grew up with his father learning plants and botanizing in the landscape, and a lot of it was changing. It was being converted to agriculture and other development, and he thought we should probably save some of this, and we need to have a system to set aside land and protect it. So he came up with the idea of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. And in, I think it was about 1968, it was passed into law, and he didn't get it exactly the way he wanted it, and it failed the first time, but the second time it did make its way through, and it established a state law that said a landowner can willingly enroll their land into this system, and it will be protected forever. You can't have eminent domain, you can't have logging or build a house or It has a lot of restrictions on it because it's meant to be set aside and saved. And the landowner willingly does this. No one is made to do this. They say, I want my land to be protected. And you can't just protect any land. It has to qualify as a high quality natural community. So it's really powerful that we have this law to save land, both public and private. And Illinois was the first state to do this. Illinois was a pioneer in the movement of the natural areas movement of saving land, and now a lot of other states have modeled their natural areas program after what Illinois had developed. And if you know or heard of Arthur Melville Pearson, he wrote this wonderful book that's the biography of George Fell's life, and it's a great read, and it talks not only about the movement and George and his life with his wife and what they did in their lifetime, but also about just the natural areas movement in general. It started in Illinois, and a lot of it started with George Fell. He started the Nature Conservancy. His wife and him moved to Washington, D.C., and the Nature Conservancy had $300 in their bank account. And you know how the Nature Conservancy turned out. And him and his wife were dedicated to living very frugally, and they would sleep in their car, and they would pack sandwiches, and they would do whatever they needed to do to care for the land and do what was right. And he, for a lot of his life, barely drew an income. And his wife was dedicated to supporting him, and she worked a lot so he could be out protecting land and building on these ideas and really creating a legacy. George Fell's name, you should think of George Fell when you think of John Muir, when you think of Teddy Roosevelt and all these other conservation leaders, because he started it, and it came out of Illinois. He lived in Rockford, so there's this great book about his legacy. And he had this quote at the time where he said, basically, we are changing the land so quickly that we'll never have another chance. Once it's gone, it's gone. So we need to save what we can save now. And we were able to do that in a lot of cases. And now Illinois has over 500 nature preserves. So successful endeavor for sure. Now that we had a system for saving land in Illinois, we needed to know, well, let's figure out where all the natural areas are. And then we can create some kind of prioritization list so that the state can acquire these lands and protect them, because if the landowner wasn't interested in protecting it, there's nothing that could be done. They would wait until it would go for sale, and they would try to buy it. And through the 80s, Illinois DNR was really good at buying land and acquiring it and protecting it. But that was hard to maintain through all the political winds and the budget issues, and so we're not so much a leader in that particular area, but we've done a lot of great things so far. So they said, okay, let's do this natural areas inventory. It's going to be a systematic statewide analysis of the entire landscape to find potential natural areas. And they found after the project of 3 years and adding up all the little pieces, just 0.07% of the state was found to be in a pristine or nearly pristine natural condition. We rank 49 out of 50. Iowa is the only state that has less natural land than Illinois. So we have definitely taken a lot of it. But that being said, there are natural areas all over the state. Every single county has a natural area, and there's 102 counties in Illinois. So of course there's a large density of them up in the northeast region, and then down here, of course, southern Illinois has a lot of natural areas, in the Shawnee National Forest and other landowners. So the INAI has different categories, but what I keep referring to are the high quality natural communities, Category 1 natural areas. Okay, so a natural area is a term that's used very loosely. You could look outside and say, this is a natural area, it's undeveloped. But in Illinois, we actually have a definition. It's on the inventory as a high quality remnant on the landscape. So here's another graph to sort of display how little is left in Illinois. This giant circle represents the state at 36 million acres. The amount of high quality natural communities is just this little tiny red circle at about just under 28,000 acres. And this is a 1979 statistic, so it's a little dated. We've lost some areas, but we've also enhanced others. And this table here then shows all the natural community types that are known in the state. So if you go to a natural area or you're classifying them, you have to fit it into this table. We have types of forests, types of prairies. It's basically a hierarchical classification of these natural communities. So that perfectly leads to this quote, which I really favor. Every scrap of biodiversity is priceless, never to be surrendered without a struggle, which E.O. Wilson said. And that is very true in Illinois. We have little left, and what's left is priceless, and we need to make sure that it persists. And a good example of that is this flower here, the Kankakee mallow. And the Kankakee mallow is believed to only occur in Illinois. We call it an Illinois endemic species. And it only occurs on Langham Island at Kankakee River State Park. and is now a nature preserve. And the fact that it's on an island helps it a little bit. You know, it's protected in some way. But when the Kankakee River is low, you can wade across and go to this island. So I was asked to lead a field trip in 2014 for the Illinois Native Plant Society. They said, we want you to, you know, I love the canoe, I love plants. I said, okay, great combination. Take a guide, you know, be the guide, take the people down the river in canoes and go show them this wildflower. I had never seen it. I said, okay. So we canoe down, takes most of the day, we get to the island and it's just covered in honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. We can't even search for plants. None were found. People were horrified. We'd gone on this field trip to go see this wildflower and it's gone, it's special, Illinois, only place. Well, the good thing out of that is that immediate call to action. People on that field trip were out the next weekend clearing honeysuckle and burning it and helping the land. And the Kankakee mallow really responds to wildfire. So, but it takes a couple of years to bloom. So the first year, plants were up everywhere, and in 2016 they bloomed. And the Chicago Tribune had an article, you know, wildflower brought back from extinction, basically. And it's a really amazing story that we brought this and are caring for it. And kind of the irony in this situation somewhat is that you can buy these seeds from Prairie Moon Nursery and it's fairly easy to grow. And I took these pictures actually in my friend's wildflower garden down in southern Illinois. So it's rare in the wild, but you actually can obtain it and grow in your garden, which is the point of this presentation. So here's a picture that shows one of these high quality remnants. This is Sunbury Prairie. This is a railroad prairie. And they call it that because there was an old railroad on this berm here. It's been removed, but that was where the railroad was. And you see there's a fence line here with, you know, agriculture behind it. So in between the fence and the railroad here, just this little strip from this tree to about where I'm standing, they're small little remnants, but priceless. And the key to this, the high quality prairie is that it was never plowed. If you plow a prairie, it's toast. It'll never come back. It'll never be the same. But you can have it grazed, you can burn it, you can mow it, it'll all come back. But if it's plowed, it's done. So you want to make sure, you know, these very rare to find these unplowed pieces of ground. This lead plant, but all this gray bushy stuff is lead plant, which has a really deep taproot. So once you plow, you know, lead plant's gone. You won't find it in the prairie anymore. So here's an example of a remnant. Now I had an opportunity to work on what they called the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory Update. So in 2008, did the same project statewide, hired 5 ecologists. They said, okay, use your own vehicle, work out of your home, we'll reimburse you. Here's a microscope, a computer, a GPS unit, a summer assistant, everything you would need to go out and find new natural areas. And that's what I did for 4 years. And I had 19 counties in red. I had southern Illinois, but I actually later went on to work up here in the Northeast area. So I have a lot of experience in southern Illinois and in the Northeast doing this kind of work. But I had 19 counties, 685 potential natural areas, and basically took tons of photos and drove all over the place and spent most of my time outdoors. So it's an amazing opportunity to learn. And then this site, everything on this map shows all the sites that the 5 ecologists had identified as natural areas throughout the state. So quickly before I get into the plants, I want to mention the glacial history of Illinois because it has a very a strong influence on where plants grow. So 15,000 years ago was our last ice age, and that was the white area here, covered a lot of Illinois. So you think all that area was under ice 15,000 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. All those plants had to re-establish themselves and recolonize. So this area of Illinois is very young. Versus here we have the blue circle, or the blue area, which includes the gray. That was the Illinois glaciation 150,000 years ago. So that was the main glacial episode that covered the entire state and flattened it and filled in the valleys and everything. But we have a few areas that were never glaciated. We have the driftless region in northwest Illinois. If you've been to Galena, it's very steep and hilly, unglaciated. Calhoun County is where the Illinois and the Mississippi rivers meet. It's also very steep, unglaciated. We have a little bit here, East St. Louis area, and then of course, southern Illinois. They say roughly south of Route 13, which is, you know, Carbondale, Marion, Harrisburg, and south, unglaciated terrain. So that has very important implications for the plant life in these particular areas. So this shows how the glacial ice, for whatever reason, it came down and it went around the corners of Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois, and it never glaciated. They call it the driftless region. And then this graph here shows how thick the ice was. Just, you know, miles thick, they say. In fact, the ice melted the ice was so heavy it pushed the earth down. And now that it's melted, the earth is rebounding. So Illinois is actually gaining a little tiny bit in elevation every year because it's still rebounding from having all that weight lifted off. Okay, we haven't had a joke in a little while. Better mix one in. How do you tell the male parts of a flower from the female parts? Well, the females have a lot of style, but the men have all the anthers. Okay, if you don't think that's funny, then what's the matter with you? Okay, so Illinois is pretty diverse, about 3,600 species. You know, statewide or countrywide, we rank 25th out of 50, but some states are bigger, so obviously California's first and Texas is ranked high. But Illinois, situated in the middle of North America, in the middle of the United States, we get a north-south and east-west influence. 20% of the species in Illinois are on the edge of their range. So if we were, a little bit different orientation, there would be 20% less vegetation, probably. So we have a lot of things that just barely make it into Illinois. It's the southern edge of the northern adapted plants and the northern edge of the southern adapted plants. They really all meet here in Illinois. Okay, oops. Okay, so now I want to go, or I also want to mention that we've divided the state into natural divisions. There are 14 different natural divisions, and each is further divided into sections. So this shows just a graph of the different kinds. So we're at number 3 here, the northeastern morainal division. And a moraine is a pile of rocks left by the glaciers, basically. So we're in an area where there's lots of moraines. So I mention this because I'm going to be speaking now about wildflowers that you may want to incorporate into your home landscape or city park or what have you. And you want to make sure that you choose plants that are native to your region. So I would say at a very basic level, I would say at least pick plants that are native to North America. Okay, because a lot of things are from somewhere else. So just start with North America. Ideally, it's native to Illinois. Even more ideally than that is that you get local ecotype seed. And that means that if you buy an American beech from New Jersey, it's not going to behave the same way as an American beech from Illinois. There's subtle differences in the genes that allow it to, that it has evolved in this area, so it's more adapted for these conditions. So you want to ideally get seed that's from within, 100 miles or so, depending on if it's wind pollinated or what. So also in northern Illinois, you might be better suited to choose a plant that's native to Wisconsin than you would to choose a plant native to southern Illinois. So you think about where you're located, pick plants that are native nearby. So some of the basics here about why use native plants. I like to always refer to this quote, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And that's saying that these plants evolved in North America at this location. So all the things that they interact with, they've all been co-evolved together, like I mentioned earlier, the soil, the climate, the microbes, the insects, and all these interactions that are going on, which is what's really beneficial about native plants. So they're adapted to local conditions. They'll do the best because they're from this area. Of course, another reason is they support native wildlife. Doug Tallamy has his book, Bringing Nature Home, where he's talking about using native plants because his whole thing is insects, caterpillars. And he says a Bradford pear, which places love to plant, harbors no caterpillars. That you won't find any on them. But you go with like a cherry or an oak, you can get hundreds. So that's the point, is that we need native plants for our native insects, which then feed our native wildlife, like birds. Most people would agree they like birds and they want birds around. Well, birds can eat seed, and you can put a bird feeder out, but the baby birds exclusively eat insects. So the mama birds have to be able to go out and find lots of insects, and they do that when native plants are around. Okay? Oh, and then I also mentioned that once established, they can actually be less maintenance. You're not mowing anymore. They do require some weeding and some maintenance, but once you get your perennial plants established, they should actually be fairly low maintenance, and then that'll make them cheaper in the long run as well. Okay, so some strategies for planting. I have to give you a big caveat here. I am not a gardener. I'm a botanist. I spend my time in the wild looking at plants. So I'm not an expert about how does this grow and how am I struggling with this or whatever. But generally, you can say, pick things that have lots of different color. You don't want just yellow flowers. You want lots of different colors. You want to consider when they bloom. You don't want you don't want only spring plants. You want things to bloom throughout the year. So consider when did they bloom. So you can always have some things in bloom. And then think about your soil light conditions. At a very basic level then, is it shade or sun, wet or dry? And consider those combinations when selecting vegetation. And then also don't forget about the grasses and the ferns and the shrubs. Of course, the showy wildflowers are what people are drawn to, but we can also have very lovely landscaping mixing in ferns, grasses, sedges, and our shrubs. So, I'm going to skip over these. Mention a few resources for identification. I like this Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. It's a good intermediate guide that has drawings. It's inclusive or comprehensive enough to satisfy the technical aspect, but it's also user-friendly, so it's very approachable for the amateur to use to identify wildflowers. Okay, and then of course, if you want to really graduate to the technical level, you get either the Flora of Illinois or Flora of the Chicago region if you're in this area. And these are extremely technical, hard to use manuals, but that's really the textbook for this sort of thing would be to have one of these books. And of course, the Native Plant Society again. And on our website, we have a list of native plant nurseries and plant identification resources. So at the website here, and I have some stickers up here that are free as well, and they have the website written on them. So you can take one of those and look at our website, and there's lots of useful tools there, resources. Okay, let's talk about plants. This is me at the people party. No one wants to talk about plants. Or if I want to be a little more aggressive, I try this approach. Sneak botany in an innocent conversation. All right, so I thought a good place to start might be with milkweeds. Milkweeds are trending these days because they're, of course, the host plant for monarch butterflies and their caterpillars, and monarchs are on the decline, so there's a whole thing about, hey, let's try to get more milkweed out there. So the DNR produced this poster for classrooms and teachers and students, and it has all the native milkweeds in Illinois, and they used a number of my photos on the poster. Well, I figured let's go through. There's 19 Asclepias milkweeds in Illinois. And of course, this very showy one is Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed. Very easy to grow, commonly in lots of home landscaping. Aptly named, it draws in butterflies like crazy. And this is the only orange-colored milkweed that we have. We also have swamp milkweed. Those of you who were on the walk earlier, we saw swamp milkweed blooming down here at the Swan Pond. Another beautiful one, easy to grow. We have common and variegated. The variegated is just down south, and the common is also aptly named. It is very common. We saw that one this morning as well. Now here's the tall green and horsetail. These are two smaller leaved and smaller flowered ones. You can see a monarch caterpillar right here on the tall green milkweed. Okay. And we also have poke milkweed and purple milkweed. The purple milkweed has really nice big flowers. Poke milkweed has few white flowers that are really scattered on the inflorescence. World milkweed has whorled leaves. Quadrifolia, that's what that means, leaves of 4. White swamp milkweed, I also alluded to on the walk. These seeds are winged. So this grows in swamps and floodplain areas where the wind doesn't go. Most of the milkweeds, they have a milkweed pod, it opens up, it's got the cottony fluff, they float off in the wind. Well, there's no wind in the wooded forest, so these are adapted for water dispersal. The winged seed floats on the water and is carried, dispersed that way. And then up here we have this beautiful prairie milkweed, Asclepias sullivantii. It's really a stunner. And we also have the green and the green flowered milkweed. Kind of funny about these is that Asclepias viridiflora. Viridiflora means green flowered, but that's the green milkweed. Viridis means green, but that's the green flowered milkweed. So I think somebody got those common names a little backwards, but they're both green flowering milkweeds we have on our landscape. Now, if you're in sand, you have sandy soil, we have our sand milkweed, Asclepias amplexicalis. You see it has very few leaves on the stem and a long stalk with the flowers up at the tip. Sand milkweed. Now here we have some rare milkweeds too. This woolly milkweed, very rare, Asclepias lanuginosa, very hairy, woolly. One of the problems with these rare milkweeds is that they're inbred. there's no genetic diversity. There's not very many plants, and so they don't make, they're sterile because they're so inbred. Their genetics is not enough genetic recombination going on. So sometimes they try to get plants from a neighboring state or neighboring area and bring them in so that they get some more genetic diversity, get them to set seed. But these two are the rarest milkweeds. The Mead's milkweed is federally threatened. It's very uncommon, very rare, I should say. And then Asclepias ovalifolia is the oval-leaved milkweed. And it is also very rare. It's only known in Cook County. And it was actually extinct for a long time, or extirpated. Extirpated means it still occurs somewhere else, but not locally. So it was extirpated from Illinois. And in 1986, it was found in a Cook County Forest Preserve. And there was one plant flowering, and they thought, we gotta get this plant to make fruit so we can get more. And I forget the details, but I think maybe they were trying to hand pollinate it, trying to get it to make seed. And they broke it in half. They broke the stem, but it was attached, but it was hanging down. And they set it upright, and they took masking tape, and they taped it back upright, and it made a fruit pod. And they took that fruit pod, and they brought it to the Morton Arboretum, and they propagated it, and they got more plants. So it was almost lost, the one they had. But now it's not, there aren't lots of them, but there are more than one, and they're still there. So it's really rare milkweed here in the Chicago region. All right, so those are our native milkweeds. So now I have this talk divided into three sections: prairie, woodland, and wetlands. So we'll start with the prairie. This is Illinois Beach State Park, a premier site of the nature preserve system. This is our first nature preserve in Illinois. And since Illinois was the first state to have a nature preserve system, this makes this the first nature preserve in the nation. And when you go to the parking lot, they have a sign there that tells you, this is the nation's first nature preserve. That is one heck of a distinction. And we have it here in Illinois on the coast of Lake Michigan. So Illinois is known as the Prairie State. Unfortunately, there's very little prairie left. And so in the 1960s, prairie enthusiasts and led by Dr. Betts, university professor, they started to look for where are the prairies that remain. So in Illinois, there's 22 million of the 36 million acres was tallgrass prairie originally. Now they estimate about 2,200 acres remain. So 1/100% of our prairie remains. And that includes all types of prairie. We have gravel prairie, sand prairie, hill prairie, glacial drift prairie, lots of dolomite prairies. But the virgin black soil, deep, rich, organic soil, very rare. They estimate just 18 acres remain in the state, because this is the richest soil in the world, and we've converted it to agriculture. Okay, so a representation of this, how little is left, is you take the entire state of Illinois and you scale it down to a regular piece of paper, type a single lowercase o on the paper, fill in half of that o, and that's the amount of black soil prairie remaining in Illinois relative to the size of the state. A very small amount, and what is left, absolutely priceless. So this whole concept led Aldo Leopold to say, "Puccoons only converse with the dead." And what he noticed during his time was he didn't see this horrid puccoon wildflower growing on the roadsides, growing in the pastures, growing in all the places that he spent time, but he went into these pioneer cemetery prairies in the late 1800s. Settlers were buried in the prairie. It was set aside. It was never plowed. That's the key. It was grazed, it was burned, it was mowed, it was never plowed. And so in the 60s, they started to go to these cemetery prairies to see what prairie plants were there. And most of them were being mowed, so they called it bonsai prairie plants, because they'd see little prairie docks and little greyheaded combflowers and little blazing stars, and enough to say, there's native prairie here. And they'd go to cemetery association and say, can you stop mowing? In a lot of cases they did, and rich, priceless Illinois prairie grew in its place. And now a lot of them are saved as Illinois nature preserves. So Aldo said they only converse with the dead because this plant was only in these pioneer cemetery prairies that were set aside and unplowed, where the true prairie remains. So in Illinois, we have a number of these cemetery prairies. Here's Munson. You can see the gravestones there mixed in with the high quality prairie, and of course the vast agriculture that surrounds the land. But the prairie plants are right there all mixed in. So this is the site on Google Maps. I think this green square is about 20 acres. and maybe 3/4 of that is high quality prairie or so, or maybe a little less. So it's really small. So if we zoom out here, you can see this big square. That's one section. A section is a square mile, 640 acres, and there's the 20 or so acres of Munson. Now let's zoom out even farther. So now this is 1 square mile, this little piece, and here's Munson, and here's the surrounding landscape, of course. It's all been converted to roads and houses and agriculture, and the little tiny prairie is just a little island where we let these native prairie plants remain. So I had an article in the Chicago Tribune a couple of years ago, and I spoke with them about highlighting these cemetery prairies, and it was a well-written article. I suggest you Google it, and there's a video that goes along with it, and it talks about the importance of cemetery prairie in Illinois. So here's a map that shows there are 29 high-quality cemetery prairies across the state. Okay, and some of the plants that have prairie in the name that grow in the prairie, there's the queen of the prairie, easy to get seed, easy to grow. A lot of people have this. It likes a little wet situations, even though it is a prairie. It might be a wet prairie or sedge meadow species. We have the Prairie Gentian, a nice deep blue color. These bloom later in the year. Now this might be a little bit misleading for me to have this in the presentation because this is a hard species to grow, gentian. If you see Prairie Gentian, you know you're in a really high quality, rich area. Okay, and then here's all the Illinois gentians. They bloom in the fall, so it's nice to have this blue color late in the year when it seems to be dominated by yellows and whites. So you can have nice blue color later. And this stunner is the Prairie Lily. Also one that's probably a little bit on the harder end to grow, but very conservative plant of our prairie landscape. But the easier one to propagate would be the Michigan lily, its cousin, and it has, of course, the reflexed tepals there that point back upwards. Lilium michiganense. Wild hyacinth is another one to consider. This is at Cave Creek Glade down in Johnson County. But it's a beautiful wildflower, blooms really early, very showy white flowers on them. And of course, blazing stars. We were looking at blazing star just right outside the building here. And they're easy to grow. Obviously, to see them put in this restoration area. Nice purple color for your landscape. And Rattlesnake Master is also easy one to grow and put into prairie restoration or in your yard. And of course it's called Euringium yuccifolium, and folium is referring to the foliage, and yucca refers to yucca the plant, so it's saying leaves like yucca. If you see the leaves there, they do very much look like yucca. They're very fibrous. You can take them and pull them into long strips, and you can weave them into various different things. In fact, in Illinois, there was a researcher studying pack rats, or wood rats. We have an endangered rat in Illinois, and this guy was studying them, and of course they hoard things and they put them in their nests. And he found one under this boulder in this hard to access site, and he found a slipper-like artifact, or a sandal. And he put it in a box and noted it in his report, but he was really studying the ecology of the rats, so he wasn't that interested in the sandal, but he noted it, and an archaeologist came across it and he said, oh, I wonder what this is. So he found it, he had it tested, and they determined it was made out of 5,000-year-old Rattlesnake Master fibers that were woven by a native indigenous person into a sandal, and it became the oldest known textile that has ever been found in Illinois. 5,000-year-old sandal made of Rattlesnake Master. Greyheaded Combflower is a super easy one to grow and put in your landscape. We see a lot of restorations that are wild bergamot and greyheaded coneflower almost exclusively. And of course you would ideally want a little more diversity, but those two are native plants that are very showy, very easy to grow, very common on our landscape. Garden vervain, as the name implies, is another good native wildflower that grows well in gardens. I don't see this one in the wild all that much, but I do see it planted quite often. So it's a neat one to consider that has a nice purple color and blooms fairly early in the year. In fact, here's me at LaRue Pine Hills, one of the only wild populations that I know of, and it was having a nice year blooming in early April. Okay, now here are some of the Baptisia, kind of a weird name, white wild indigo bush. And you're like, well, is it indigo or is it white? What color? Well, these are white. Baptisia alba, and alba means white, of course. So these are bush, these are herbaceous plants, but it's kind of shrubby in its stature. It looks like a bush. And often they'll actually break off at the base, and they have these seed pods on them, and they'll roll in the wind and throw seeds out. So kind of like a tumbleweed in that respect, blows around in the landscape. But sometimes it's hard to find seeds for these. They make, it's a legume, so it makes a seed pod, bean pod. And you open them sometimes, and they're full of weevils. And the weevils like to eat the seeds. So here's a Floyd Swink joke for you that I heard. He would say he'd open up a Baptisia pod, and he'd find 2 weevils. And he'd make sure that one was smaller than the rest. And he'd say, hey, you see this weevil is smaller than these other ones? It's the lesser of 2 weevils. All right, moving on to spiderwort. Spiderwort's also pretty easy to grow and incorporate. This is the Ohio spiderwort. It likes full sun. It likes it where it's a little bit wet, but it's a monocot. I took this picture at Palatine Prairie in Palatine, where there's a nice display of spiderworts there. And of course, the spiderwort, wort is the Old English word for plant. So we see St. John's wort and moneywort and pennywort and all these worts. It just means plant. But the spider refers to, it has very stringy, silky sap. So if you break a leaf and play with the sap, it's kind of sticky, and you can kind of pull your fingers apart, and it looks like silk. Hence the name, the spiderwort. Okay, and another one here. This one has whorled leaves. It's called Culvers Root, and it has this candelabra inflorescence of flowers, and pollinators love it. You see there's a bee right here flying all over this thing, and it's a nice tall plant. It's really a good one for putting in the landscape, bringing in various pollinators. Now here's shooting star. I took this picture at Spring Creek Prairie, which is sort of outside of Barrington on Dundee Road, and it had an explosion, full glorious bloom of our common shooting star. And shooting stars take 10 years to flower from seed, so you're playing the long game here if you want to plant this. But of course, it's a beautiful wildflower. Actually, I think sometimes you can get cuttings. So if you know someone that has some, you can take a cutting off their plant and get it into your yard. And of course, black-eyed Susans. Somebody might scoff at the idea of actually planting a black-eyed Susan because they're so common and they come in on their own. But it is a native wildflower and has a lot of benefit. And of course, Rudbeckia refers to Dr. Rudbeck. So Carl Linnaeus named a lot of these plants, and his mentor was Dr. Rudbeck. So he named this whole genus to honor him. So I think that's kind of a cool association for this. Now moving on to passion flower. This is another one that can actually be kind of aggressive in a landscaping situation, but it is a beautiful native vine. These flowers, they're about this big, so they're fairly large, and it's just a beautifully intricate, wild-looking wildflower. Its cousin is the yellow passion flower, and those are about the size of a quarter. They're really small, and they're cream-colored. Otherwise, they look very similar. So these are really big and showy, and just really a remarkable flower to have and look at. And of course, cacti may also be somewhat of a curious selection for your garden, as in if you touch these, they can fill you with little spines and things. But they're actually fairly easy to grow. In fact, you can break a pad off of one and just stick the pad in, and it'll grow into a new plant. And it has this beautiful, large yellow flower on them. And again, it likes sand. So if you have sandy soil, cactus would be a neat one to put in with the garden landscape. But one of my favorites here is wild lupin, also like sand. We don't have a lot of sand areas in Illinois, but the Kankakee Sands and Will County is a lot of sand, Sand Ridge and Cook County and places like that. Sandy areas will have the wild lupin. And this is the host plant for the federally endangered Carner blue butterfly. So it's another good reason to have this in your landscape. Beautiful blue color. It's a legume, really fantastic. Lupinus perennis. And of course, beard's tongue, penstemon. We have lots of different penstemon species. They are pollinator magnets. You get all kinds of wasps and bees and other flying critters that like to visit penstemon and the beard's tongues. So definitely consider having one of those around. And then, as I mentioned before, with the Greyheaded Combflower, wild bergamot is very easy to grow, very showy. It's in the mint family, so it has a wonderful fragrance. And really, all the monardas are fantastic options for the landscape. And purple coneflowers as well. This is the pale purple coneflower here. Coneflowers, very pretty and also commonly used in landscaping. I'm always looking for what I call the mass blooms, full glorious bloom. This here is cleft phlox. You see cleft phlox sold a lot in nurseries, also easy to grow. Has a very creeping habitat, so it kind of sprawls on its own. Also, wood betony, sometimes interesting to have. If you have more of a, instead of like a garden, you have more of just like a restoration or a place where you let multiple plants grow together. Sometimes some can be kind of aggressive, and this is a hemiparasite, which means it's parasitic on other plants, so it'll actually attack or steal nutrients from some of these aggressive plants and keep them at a manageable level. So it's interesting and useful to have the wood betony around. It is green, so it can photosynthesize on its own. That's why we call it a hemiparasite. It's half parasitic. It can photosynthesize and it can steal nutrients from other plants. And New Jersey tea can be a little shrub-like, but it also is a pollinator magnet. Tons of pollinators come in the New Jersey tea. Not one that you see a lot. It's a conservative plant. So definitely an indicator of high-quality habitats. And there's some other shrubby-like things. The shrubby cinquefoil, Dicephora fruticosa, and fruticosa means shrubby. This is actually not a very common wildflower in the natural landscape, but it's an easy one to find in the nursery trade. In fact, when I was first learning plants, my twin sister had me over and she was trying to stump me in her yard. You know, what's this? Name that. What's that? And the first one she said here, I was like, oh, Dicephora fruticosa. And she thought, oh, okay. You did learn a thing or two in college, I guess. So moving on, of course, the roses. We have some roses. Roses have prickles on them, so you have to be careful when handling them. Of course, you know prickles. They have prickles. You've heard that song by Poison. Every rose has its prickle. Right, when we say roses have thorns, they're not thorns. They're prickles. There's a difference there in armature, but we call most things thorns. But they have these beautiful, a rose by any other name would not be as sweet. Rosa satigera. Now, I'm going to end the prairie section here with some rare plants that are on our endangered species list, but are easy to obtain and easy to grow. First is blue sage. And wild locations of blue sage are very rare, but it is actually fairly common in restorations and put into the prairie landscape. So commonly planted, but it occurs down in southern Illinois on limestone is one of our rare plants. Salvia arzurea. Also royal catchfly. I mean, royal catchfly is in every prairie planting. It's so easy to grow, but wild populations, I think there's only 2. It is extremely rare in the wild. We've destroyed most of the habitat, but it's really easy to grow. And underneath the flower petals is the calyx, this green part here. And the calyx is super sticky, and that's where it gets the name catchfly. The flies will come in and they'll get stuck to the side of the calyx, but it's not carnivorous or anything. That's the name. And of course, it's just, you know, red is the least common color. We have lots of whites, lots of yellows, lots of pink, blues, purples, but very few red. And reds are what hummingbirds normally visit. So if you want hummingbirds, if you want a different color, red is a very good one to use. And bundleflower is another one, easy to grow, Illinois endangered. Wild populations are just hard to find, but it's not hard to get seed, not too hard to grow. The Melanthium virginicum. And beard's tongue. There's only, I think, 6 locations for this up in the sand areas of northwest Illinois, but it's one that I've seen a lot planted in prairie restorations, roadsides, gardens, etc. Nice big flowers like the name implies. Grandiflorist, the largest flowers. And now this one here, the leafy prairie clover, I've actually heard you can buy seed for this, but it is the only federally endangered plant in Illinois. We have a number of federally threatened species. This is the only federally endangered. So very rare. In fact, it was thought gone or extirpated for a long time and then rediscovered in Will County, and it's doing well at the site. They put a cage around it because the deer like to eat it, and the plants are coming out of the cage and growing out around the cage, so they're expanding, and it's really good to see. Now, don't confuse this with the common purple prairie clover, which is in a lot of prairies. This is a very rare, similar leafy prairie clover, Dahlia foliosa. Okay. Now, some places to want to mention, the Chuseok Grasslands is an awesome place to go see prairie reconstructed. I talked about all these natural community remnants on the landscape. They're really small, and at a certain point, it was like, okay, we've saved a lot of these small remnants, but they're so small they don't have the same utility as a larger area. So let's see if maybe we can build one. We're going to put it back. So this land was purchased by the Nature Conservancy, and Bill Kleiman has been the manager there for over 20 years, and they basically bought these little remnants surrounded by farmland, and they converted the farmland back to prairie, and it's been very successful. A wonderful job they've done there in Chuseok. Now I have like 4,000 acres or so of varying quality of prairie, and of course they put bison back on the scene there as well. And some orchids here that grow on the prairie. The iconic orchid of the prairie really was the eastern prairie fringed orchid. And accounts from settlers talk about riding horseback across the prairie and seeing white as far as the eye could see. These are kind of tall plants, 3-4 feet tall. And so they were just pervasive, but they were over-collected. Of course, we've taken their habitat. So they're quite rare, but we've been able to put these back fairly well. And this is another one where it's not pollinated all the time. And so they take toothpicks and they go from these plants over here and they bring the pollinia and they pollinate them over here and get them to produce seed. And then once they have seeds, they can sprinkle them in a new place. So we've really been able to put these back. And these are orchid seeds. This is a pod. Each little tiny fleck of dust is a seed. And orchids don't have any endosperm in their seed. They have no energy reserves for the plant to use to grow when it's young, and that's why orchids are so rare. They have these seeds that are blow in the wind. They're presumably ubiquitous in the environment, but orchids are rare because they have to land at the right place where they have an association with this mycorrhizal soil fungi. They don't have energy to grow. They have to land with where this mycorrhizae is, and they start to have a symbiosis with them, and they take nutrients in order to grow until they're large enough to photosynthesize and make their own food. So orchids are very picky for that reason. They need the mycorrhizal soil. So lastly in the prairie section, I just want to mention that there are many types of prairie. So here's a gravel prairie at Shoe Factory Road Nature Preserve in Schaumburg. Here's another gravel prairie, Bluff Spring Fen, which is in Elgin. We have Lockport Prairie, which is a dolomite prairie. So dolomite is very close to the surface, very thin soils. Wilmington Shrub Prairie. The shrub here is hardhack or spirea. So we have places where we should have some native shrubs. We call them shrub prairies. They're even rarer than prairies, the shrub prairie. It's extremely rare. And then, of course, the hill prairie, like at Fultz Hill Prairie. So perched up here, high above the cliffs, is the hill prairie. They have a west-facing aspect, which keeps them dry and keeps trees from growing to some extent. And the hill prairies there. Okay, let's move on to the middle section, the wetlands. This is the Dead River, also at Illinois Beach State Park. You can see the pickerel weed, these purple flowers growing there. So some wetland plants to consider in your garden, of course, irises. Now we have a purple iris that's like a dark purple that's not native. There's a yellow one that's not native. But our native ones are blue, and even down south we have the red or copper iris, Iris fulva. Wonderful irises. They don't bloom for that long, but they are wonderful wetland plants. Of course, Cardinal Flower. Again, the red is a nice color to use and brings in hummingbirds. Really deep, deep red color in this one. I've heard some people complain that it doesn't bloom very long, and that's why they, sometimes don't favor it, but it is a wonderful color, an easy wetland plant to use. Excuse me. And spider lily. So one of my favorite places down south is called Heron Pond. It's a cypress swamp, and along the trail you can see all kinds of spider lilies, and also they're tall, 4 feet tall, big white flowers on them. Not a true lily, it's actually an amaranthus, or amaryllis. Amaryllidaceae is the family. And then here we have white turtlehead. We actually have pink turtlehead and white turtlehead. Both easy to incorporate in the home garden and landscape. They like little moisture conditions. Of course, these turtleheads, the genus Chelone means turtle. So it's a good name. And it's the host plant for the Baltimore checker spot, which is an endangered butterfly in Illinois. So another good reason to have them. You know, part of the reason with these native plants is to help support our native wildlife. So the checker spots will do well if we plant more turtlehead. And there's the pink variety. And these bloom late in the year. This pink one blooms in September. So it seems like late in the year, things are kind of winding down, and all of a sudden you get new, fresh bloomers. So it's a good one to have. Jewelweed, of course, some gardeners might scoff at the suggestion of, recommending jewelweed because it can be very dominant and aggressive. But it is also visited by hummingbirds, and it's really just a delightful little wildflower. Kind of funny story about this, I actually studied turtles in graduate school, but I was always interested in plants. And my turtle colleagues would always ask me, oh, what's this flower, what's this one? And this one was blooming, and my colleague had his hand on the leaf, and he was holding it, and he said, what's this plant called? I said, it's called touch-me-not. And he goes, why do they call it that? And they call it that because it has these seeds that, when they're ripe, they're all inflated and sort of bound up, and you just barely touch the seed pod, and they explode and send seeds everywhere. That's why they call it touch-me-not. But jewelweed is another name. If you take a leaf, and you put it in the water, and you whirl it around, it has a silvery metallic appearance. It's really, really cool to do. And that's where it gets the name jewelweed. Moving on here, this is obedient plant, another easy one to grow. And it likes it actually dry and wet, but it's called obedient plant because you're supposed to be able to take a flower and push it to the side, and they'll stay in that position. So very obedient in that sense, but also called false dragon head. Physostygia, easy one to use and grow with. And I showed the pickerel weed. We had that in the beginning slide. This is a good one if you have permanent water, you have a little pond, something like that, because it wants to be wet all the time. Or I should mention here is Ponditaria cordata, because it has a cordate leaf base or heart-shaped. Okay. Now lizard's tail, it's a hard one to pronounce. Whoever came up with the scientific name has way too many U's in it. This is Saururus cernuus. Saururus means lizard, and cernuus means nodding. So nodding lizard's tail is a pretty decent name. Also, this one will handle where it's not permanently wet, but it likes it where it's pretty moist. And it can be, in the water as well. These beautiful little nodding inflorescences. Now, marsh marigold is another one if you have a calcareous water or like a seepy, permanently discharge of water wet. You can get this early spring wildflower with the marsh marigold, really brilliantly colored yellow. And then the marsh mallow, hibiscus. There's a couple hibiscus species that are not native that people often plant. Rose of Sharon is one, flower of an hour is another one, and we have beautiful native hibiscus to use, like this one here, although these also get tall. You see them on the roadside, they're 5-6 feet tall, but pollinators really are attracted to them. And we used to make marshmallows from marshmallows. That's where we get the name marshmallow. It was from this plant. Of course, they're all synthetically derived now, but originally it was from hibiscus. And buttonbush, this is a woody plant, so it's shrubby and it can kind of grow in big clumps, but butterfly magnet. They love this. These little spiky flowers here, all these little protrusions coming out, those are the styles of the flower. So I joke and say this plant has a lot of style. Very stylish, a buttonbush. All right, let's move on to our last category, which is woodland. So this is at Deer Grove West in Cook County, where they've been doing some restoration, clearing the buckthorn and other invasive shrubs and really promoting more herbaceous vegetation. We can see there's trout lilies and mayapples in there and wild phlox and such. So here are some shade-loving species that grow in the woods for your garden landscape. Don't see Dutchman's breeches, I guess, too much, but I think I have heard of them, people being able to plant them. But these bloom really early in the year. It's formerly of the poppy family. This picture here, I happen to find some pink ones. I actually took this picture at Swallow Cliff in Cook County. And I like to joke and say, this Dutchman on here, he knew how to do his laundry. His underwear came out white. But this one put a red handkerchief in or something, and his underwear came out pink. The Dutchman's breeches. Whoops. Pretty little color. In trilliums, we have lots of trilliums. This is the large white trillium, Trillium flexipes. You see these flowers are actually on a stalk above the leaves. So that's an identifying characteristic. You also have red trillium you can find in the nursery trade, Illinois endangered. Those who are on the walk remember me saying that the maroon flowers are often foul smelling because they're attracting carrion feeders like beetles and flies. So sometimes this is called ill-scented trillium. With those, the maroon color looks like rotting flesh. It often smells like rotting flesh to attract its pollinator, the carrion feeders. And then hepatica is an absolutely wonderful wildflower. It's one of our earliest bloomers. And they can bloom white, they can bloom pink, and it's really special when you find them blooming blue like this. Really blue. But liverleaf comes from the principle of the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures was an idea that was a religious concept that herbalists basically had aspired or adopted at one time, and it said that if God created disease, God must have created a cure to that disease. And since the medicine at the time was plants, that he had marked the plants with his signature, indicating how they were to be used medicinally. So if a plant resembled a body organ, they thought, well, it must be used to treat that body organ. So liver leaf, it's got 3 lobes. It turns liver colored later in the year. And so I thought, oh, we'll use it for liver ailments. Well, it's in the Ranunculaceae, the buttercup family, which is a toxic family of plants. So not the best to use medicinally, but that's where it gets the name liver leaf. We have liverwort is another one, spleenwort. These are doctrine of signatures. The plant looks like a body organ. Maybe it could be used to treat that body organ. And then even after the flowers are gone, the foliage can be quite variegated, mottled, and very pretty. This is really one of my favorite wildflowers. And this is the Acuta species because it has a fairly pointed leaves. Some of them are very rounded. That's a different species, Hepatica nobilis. Okay, some more woodland ones. We have larkspur. This is our native larkspur, the dwarf larkspur, Delphinium tricorni. Delphinium means dolphin. You see the shape of this flower before it's fully open. It's got sort of a dolphin shape to it. We also have blue star. I've been seeing a lot more landscaping using blue star. Amsonia tabernae montana. This is one of my favorite little roadside patches down in Johnson County where it has a lot of this blue star growing. It's actually in the dogbane family. So it has milky sap, but they're alternate leaved. Most dogbanes are opposite leaved. Phloxes, of course, we have lots of phloxes to use. The cool thing about phlox is the scientific name is the same as the common name. Phlox is phlox, just like geranium is geranium, just like sassafras is sassafras, and those are good common names. You use the same scientific name. Jacob's ladder, another one. You can see these paired leaves. It looks like a ladder. That's where the name comes from. And it has these they're almost translucent blue. It's a really special hue that makes this a spectacular wildflower. Again, blooms in the spring, but the foliage hangs around most of the year. So it can still be there. And then twin leaf. This is another one that is rare in the wild. Could be fun to have in your prairie garden. You can see where it gets the name twin leaf. It looks almost like a pair of wings. They're joined right there in the middle. And these flowers are super delicate. You look at them the wrong way and the petals fall off. So you have to get out there at the right time to see them blooming. And it looks like it would be related to bloodroot, but they're actually not related at all. Bloodroot is a poppy, and the twin leaf is in the barberry family. But bloodroot is also a neat little wildflower. It doesn't bloom for very long, but it's so precious, and it would be really early in the year. It'd be one that you'd be like, oh, the bloodroot is blooming, and you'll just, instantly feel immense gratification that you've incorporated that. Okay? Oh, and one of the things about bloodroot is it makes a little capsule with seeds inside, and the seeds are covered in this fatty tissue called an eliosome. And the eliosome are what ants want. These are ant-dispersed plants. Ants will take the seeds away, and they'll eat the fatty tissue around the seed, and then they'll throw the seed away because the seed's really hard. The ant can't eat it. So I like to call it ant bacon. They're after the bacon that surrounds the seed. It's the fatty tissue that's really high in nutrients. So this is ant-dispersed plant, and the fancy word for ant dispersal is myrmecoccary. So myrmecoccary, a number of spring wildflowers that they have ants that carry their seeds away and transport them around. Now, this is also one that's commonly landscaped with. Beautiful wildflower. It also doesn't flower for very long. But they turn from blue to pink, so they're really or from pink to blue, one way or the other. And they actually have this tubular flower. This is actually related to the hoary puccoon that I had in the very beginning. But instead of having a flower that flares out like the puccoon, it's actually a tubular shape with fused petals. But a beautiful one, the bluebells, Mertensia virginica. My neighbor was not all into native plants for a while. He was crazy about Japanese maples. And I was trying to, slowly preach the gospel. And I got him a celandine poppy and started to convert him to native plants. It grows really easily. It actually spreads. So you kind of got to keep it under control. But he really likes it. And I'm glad that, it's doing well there. It's a beautiful yellow wildflower. And the leaves will hang on throughout the year. And the leaves are quite pretty, I think, as well. Celandine poppy. Okay, and here we have wild columbine. So this is my wife Susan in a nice patch of wild columbine in Jackson County in Kincaid Lake. But this is also one easy to put in your landscape and a very beautiful flower again, red color. We have all kinds of non-native columbines you can buy in the nursery, but we have a native one, so we should use that one, Aquilegia canadensis. And just a few more here. Wild geranium, it's another great one. Geranium is the scientific name, geranium is the common name, and geranium is Greek, it means crane's bill. So these flowers, when they go to seed, they actually produce a long, narrow, crane-like seed pod, and those seed pods actually split open and curl back from the top, and it'll shoot the seeds out when it does that. In fact, somebody was telling me about, earlier this year, taking a bunch of unripe geranium capsules and put them in a jar, and they ripened in the jar, and they started to pew, 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 like going off like fireworks inside a little jar when they were ripe, when the capsules split open. Interestingly too, it's maculatum means spotted. So you think of the word immaculate. Immaculate means unblemished. So maculatum means spotted. I never see any spots on this plant. So I don't know if that's a misnomer or what. I've read that, it refers to the spotted leaves, but I never see the leaves spotted, so that's kind of interesting. Maculatum. Now bellwort, another one I've seen in garden landscapes and such, has these beautiful little yellow flowers that hang down. They resemble your uvula, that's where it gets the name uvularia. And it has perfoliate leaves. You see how the leaf wraps all the way around the stem of the flower? That's called perfoliate. So that's an easy identifiable characteristic. And also foliage is pretty after the flowers are done blooming. And look at this stunner, the Indian pink. This is really more in southern Illinois, but it can be planted elsewhere. And again, it's visited by hummingbirds and really just sort of a red flower with these, beautiful yellow inside. Spigelia marylandica, the Indian pink. Woodland sunflowers we saw out on the walk too, and sunflowers can be kind of aggressive, so I'd be a little careful with this one. They can grow kind of aggressively and dominate out the area, but we do have a number of Helianthus species that are sunflowers that are good for garden landscape. And of course the asters, lots of different asters. I think there's 39 or so species of aster, or Symphyotricum is the new name now in Illinois. This is the heath aster, Symphyotricum ericoides. Oh, I didn't put it in there. I have a friend who likes to say, pull up your plants, your hairy aster's showing. I always joke and say, I didn't know what it was, so I asked her. And she said, Symphyotricum ericoides, dummy. All right, moving on, here's a fame flower. This is a little succulent plant. This is very rare in Illinois. We have 3 species. One only grows in one place, and I had the opportunity of seeing it for the first time this year. This one grows at a few places, but also very restricted in southern Illinois. And then we have one in the sand, Ephemeranthus rugospermus. But all of them I've seen people grow in flower pots. And the cool thing about these is each flower only blooms for 1 hour. And it's late in the day. So it's really special, especially in the wild. The last year, I wanted to photograph the Ephemeranthus rugospermum in bloom, and I had to go 3 times to the site before finally at about 4:30 it was opening and blooming. So you got to hit them just the right time. See the exquisite little wildflower there. Now we have a number of sedums. A lot of people have sedums already in their yard. This is a native rare sedum. This blooms really late in the year. Okay, versus its cousin, the sedum here, pulchellum. Pulchellum means beautiful. And it certainly is, and it blooms really quickly. And so I like to joke and say, now you see them, now you don't. Okay? And of course, orchids. I am crazy about orchids. Orchids are hard to grow often, but you can buy plugs of Cypripedium. There are orchid growers, so this would be one you would want to probably purchase and plant as a plug. But the yellow lady slipper is just a precious wildflower. It's been poached and overcollected and eaten by deer and habitat destroyed, so once very common and now not very common at all. But I try to find some every year. In fact, just last week I found 2 stems of a plant that I had never seen them in that location, so I'm finding more and more. So my last category here before we part ways is talk about ferns, grasses, and shrubs. So here's a beautiful fern. The scientific name here is one of my favorites. It's called Phagopteris hexagonoptera, the broad beech fern. And the next issue here is the inland oats, Casmanthium latifolium, which can also be kind of aggressive in the garden, but it is a native grass. It has these cool little seeds that are very flattened, so it's very distinct. A good one for your garden. A lot of times people use prairie drop seed. I've seen some plantings on medians and parking lots that are just solid drop seed. It just has these big, bushy, clumpy grass. And it has, when it flowers, it smells like buttered popcorn. Most people really like it, but I've heard some people who, I don't like that smell. But it's fragrant either way. And it's an easy one that, takes up a lot of space. It's a big clumpy grass, the drop seed, good to use. And I say, call it cousin it sedge, or cousin it grass. It looks like a big toupee or something. Okay, so moving on here, some shrubs. Wild hydrangea. We have a native hydrangea that's somewhat woody. And of course, the hydrangeas are beautiful, bringing a lot of pollinators. We have shrubby St. John's wort. Lots of stamens here surrounding the flowers. Hypericum prolificum. Goat's beard also has butterflies that are specific to this as its host plant. Separate males and female plants. That's what dioicous means. It means it's dioecious. And the goat's beard there. Serviceberry. I think from what I've heard, these can sometimes be kind of expensive, but I think they're worth it. They bloom really early in the year. That's why they call them serviceberries, or at least some of the folklore. This may or may not be a true story, but I heard that, in the mountains in the wintertime, they couldn't bury the loved ones that died in the winter, so they'd have to put them in a coffin and, have it outside, and, they'd wait till the ground would thaw. And the pastors would know when it was time to go through the mountains to perform the services when the serviceberry was blooming. It indicated spring is here, the ground is thawed, time to go for the services. Okay? On the Amelanchier arborea. Redbud, another great pink flower, blooms, in April. The flowers come right out of the side of the stem. We call that cauliflory. Cauliflory. And this is a legume, has little pea-shaped flowers, just brilliant pink. It makes tons of flowers. It is just so pretty when the red buds are blooming. And in southern Illinois, where we have flowering dogwood, the red buds bloom about the same time. And these are also nice large flowers. Interesting here is that, I didn't have the picture. These large white petal-like structures are actually bracts. And the flowers are these little yellow ones in the middle. There's probably, 15 or so flowers, little yellow flowers in the middle. But it has these big white bracts that are attracting pollinators and bringing them in to pollinate the flowering dogwood. Pawpaw, we saw out on the walk, has this very feather-like bud on the tip. It said John James Audubon would break off pawpaw twigs and use them to paint his birds as he was traveling across Illinois and other states. Really kind of interesting. Of course, they produce the highly prized and edible pawpaw fruit that I've been seeing referred to as hipster bananas these days. You can find them, in farmers markets and other places. And they have these beautiful little blossoms. So they are maroon, and they're often foul-smelling, just like the ill-scented trillium. They're attracting carrion feeders. So sometimes you may have read or heard they say, oh yeah, your pawpaw will only produce fruit if you throw a dead animal at the base. The idea being that it'll bring in the carrion feeders. But pawpaws are clonal. If you find a pawpaw way down yonder in the pawpaw patch, that pawpaw patch is genetically identical and it cannot self-fertilize. So often they don't make fruit because you have to have pollinators that are going across multiple patches of pawpaws to bring in that genetic diversity in order for the flowers to be fertilized. Okay, just a few more here. Red buckeye. We have this as a native plant in southern Illinois, but it is widely planted and landscaped with. Beautiful red flowers that are loved by hummingbirds again. And its cousin here, the Ohio buckeye. And you know, coincidentally, we have a big tree register, and it's where we figure, you know, someone can nominate what's the biggest tree of each species in Illinois. And in Illinois, we have 4 national tree champions, which means it's the biggest tree of that species in the nation. 4 of them are in Illinois. 3 of them are in DuPage County. DuPage County is about the most developed county in the entire state, but yet it has 3 national champion trees. 2 of them are at the Morton Arboretum, and the national champion Ohio buckeye is in DuPage County. It's on the old McDonald's campus in Oak Brook. And I would like to go see it someday, and I think, take that, Ohio. We got the biggest Ohio buckeye. American strawberry bush is also good to highlight because it's in the genus Euonymus. I don't want to miss. Euonymus? I want to miss. But Euonymus is the fire shrub or the winged wahoo that's often used in landscaping because it turns this brilliant red color in the fall. It's not a good species to use. It's invasive. The birds carry it around, and it's hard to control. So here's a native alternative, Euonymus americanus, the American strawberry bush, sometimes called hearts a-busting with love, because it has these capsules, and they break open, and they show these beautiful orange-red seeds inside. Euonymus americanus. And Virginia sweet spire is another one that I see a lot, nursery trade, but in the wild, not very common. I've seen it in Heron Pond and a few places in the Shawnee Hills. But you can see pollinators love it, hang out on it. It's easy to grow, easy to put in your home landscape. And I cannot say enough about viburnum. I love black haw, rusty black haw, beautiful foliage, beautiful flowers, very fragrant. So when people were like, you know, I was told I was to cut the buckthorn and the bush honeysuckle, and now there's nothing growing there. You know, what should I do? I would say, get some viburnum. Plant some native viburnums. They're very valuable. In fact, the joke for this one is that there was a guy, he had a bunch of black haw sticks, and he was burning them in a woodpile, and I said, hey, viburnum. All right, just a couple more here. Bladdernut is neat. These flowers that hang like little chandeliers, they produce this papery capsule that looks like a lantern. And the seeds inside, once they ripen, they fall, they're not detached, and they make little rattle boxes. So it's a great one with, you know, I like to say with kids, but I'm a kid at heart. I'm still delighted by it. I find one, I rattle it around, it delights me. So it's a neat little shrub for that. It likes it in moist situations, the bladdernut there. And then spice bush. We have spice bush here, Lindera benzoin. This is also dioecious, so the females will produce these bright red berries, and these are very pleasantly fragrant. This is related to sassafras. Both sassafras and spice bush have wonderfully fragrant leaves. These smell like Fruit Loops, exactly like Fruit Loops. Tear the leaf, crush it up, Fruit Loops. So spice bush is that one. And then possum haw is nice. This is also dioecious, which means separate males and females. And so obviously this is a female with the red berries. I took this picture on my river to river hike in December. That's what's so great about this plant, is that all the green is gone, all the flowers are gone, and you have these beautiful berries. Cedar waxwings love to eat them, and other birds. So the possum haw is good. And you know, obviously you want to get a female plant because the females produce the berries, but you need a male too for the females to be pollinated, or a male nearby. So sometimes you want to get one of each for those. And then getting very late in the year, you can have witch hazel. Everything has gone dormant. You're in late October, even November, and you can get these little frilly, fringed yellow petals on the witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana. late bloomer. So, we have some insects that are still flying around late in the year, and it's important for them to get food sources, and so this is a good one to help them out as winter approaches. Okay? And then yellowwood I've been seeing planted more and more. It's in the pea family. It's a very rare tree in Illinois, so it's a good one to use. And then silverbells too, very rare in Illinois, but I've been seeing it in the nursery trade. People plant. It's a small shrub, has lots of white flowers that hang down like little bells. If you go out to the Smoky Mountains or something, you see a lot of silverbells. And here in Illinois, it's only in Massac County, Pulaski County, but planted outside of its range and does just fine. And wild azalea. I guess I can't say I've seen this used in landscaping, but I wanted you to know that we have wild azalea in Illinois. It is a fantastic wildflower. It grows at LaRue Pine Hills and Trail of Tears. I make sure to find some every year. There's 2 species. One is very fragrant, and I had to make sure this was the fragrant species there. Okay? So I'll end with this quote from Jerry's book where he says, "Remnant landscapes inspire the artist and the poet to all manner of expressions and beauty. Indeed, caring for the land in and of itself is an endeavor that can heal our own fragile souls. Alas, Mother Nature's quite a lady, but we have not been perfect gentlemen. Not only have we not looked after her and loved her, but we have rendered battery against her with so much obliviousness and misdemeanor that precious little of her countenance is recognizable." Okay, so this is the importance of it. I know this is kind of a sad quote, or depressing, but the point is this is why we're needed. This is why I'm giving this presentation and why I'm trying to inspire you to go out and seek native plants and incorporate them in your native land, your home landscaping in your garden, because we've changed so much of the landscape and the environment in Illinois that we need places for our native plants and animals to exist, and there's no reason why it can't be in your own yard. So I hope that you find these suggestions useful and that you come away with this inspired and wanting to put more native plants in a landscape in your yard, at the city park, or whatever you can influence. We want to convert lawn into more habitat for our wonderful plants and animals. So I thank you for coming out to listen to me speak, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
So I have the mic here. When you talk into it, it won't amplify, but it's for the video. Does anybody have a couple questions for Chris?
All right.
You didn't mention the Wolf Road Prairie.
Right.
Tell us about the Wolf Road Prairie. What do you think of it?
Wolf Road Prairie has seen a number of challenges through its years, but it is in now public ownership, and it is being cared after very well. So the site in its entirety is variable in its quality, but the south end where the sidewalks are in with the prairie is priceless, unmatched prairie ground. And so it's kind of surreal in that they laid the sidewalks for the development that never happened because of the depression that came in, and then the development never occurred after. So it is a priceless remnant that is now in public ownership, and I think for the most part being well cared for.
There's also the Markham Prairie.
Yes, and the Ginsberg Markham Prairie, that was another one that Robert Betts and others, it was slated for development, and it fell through, never happened, and it had seen issues of being shrubbed over and invasives, but Betts found it, and now we have Ron Panzer who's worked there for a long time on the insects and other plants, and it is it's right at right off the interstate. And it's really a great example of a larger prairie system that we've been able to protect. And there are a lot of rare plants there and intact natural communities. So yes, that is a great one to bring up. The Ginsberg Markham Prairies, a wonderful spot down about where, I think it's around where 57 and 80 come together.
We lost some dogwoods this year because of the cold, and we want to replace them now. And maybe the black haw, it's fairly dry area. Would that work there?
Yeah.
And how big do they get?
It's a larger shrub, So, I mean, they can get, 10, 12, 15 feet tall, and they kind of can expand. They can grow, sprouts around them. So they're kind of a thicker, fuller kind of shrub, depending on what your uses might be.
Okay, thank you.
Buckeye might be a good, fast-growing one, too, which has, pretty flowers. It comes to mind.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Chris, I know you said you're a botanist and not a gardener, but I do have kind of a gardening question. In the last summer, we planted a number of redbud trees, and over the winter, young trees, 6 feet tall or less, over the winter, all the branches died off, and so this spring, new growth came up from the trunk. But is that going to be just a continuous cycle, or is it worth saving those trees, or?
I'm not really sure what's going on there with that. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, but you might give it a little time and see how things start to behave.
I was just going to say the sap freezes on those in the wintertime and they break off. I mean, you get a lot of the shoots that come off the bottom, but they usually tend to break off too. It's usually better just to start over with a new tree.
Anybody else? Should we let him go, and should we thank him very much again,
Thank
Chris,
you.
for coming to see us?
So I have some free stickers, some free guidebooks, and then a few merchandise here. If you're interested, come and visit me. And of course, you're welcome to contact me. I have a few business cards here. If you have questions, as you start to do some of these things or whatever, I'm happy to correspond with you if you want to contact me. So thanks for coming out. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.